Montana Territory, August 1879. The wind kicked up the dust along the chapel steps as Tessa Kline stood at the altar, tears slipping down her cheeks. She tried to speak her vows, voice cracking under the weight of it all, but her groom, handsome, polished, and smirking, laughed. Actually laughed. People in the pews chuckled with him, like it was some quaint joke. Tessa's stomach twisted. She blinked at the man who was about to become her husband, and all she saw was a stranger in a fine suit who thought her emotion was something to mock. Then a voice cut through the quiet. "Some men do not deserve the way a woman loves." The voice came from the back of the church, low, calm, and warm as a campfire. A tall cowboy stood in the doorway, hat in hand, dust on his boots, eyes locked on her. Tessa knew him. Everyone did. Isaiah Kessler. He worked the northern ranges, broke horses no one else dared touch, and always kept to himself. Tessa had not seen him in nearly a year. Not since the day she helped stitch up his shoulder after he got caught in a barbed wire fence. He had not said much that day, just nodded and thanked her, but something had passed between them. She had felt it, even if she never knew what to say about it. Now he was here interrupting her wedding. Her groom laughed again, louder this time. "You going to cry some more, Tessa?" he said, still holding her hand like he was proud to be marrying her. She pulled her hand away like it burned. The chapel fell into silence. Everyone waited, but she did not turn back to the man beside her. She walked down the aisle, past the guests, past the preacher, straight toward Isaiah. Her veil fluttered loose and caught on a wooden bench, but she did not stop. When she reached Isaiah, she looked up at him. He gave her a soft nod. "I will cry with you next time," he said, quiet enough for only her to hear. Tessa felt her breath catch. She had not known how alone she felt until he said that. They walked out together. By the time they reached the edge of town, the sun had dipped low, the sky streaked with orange and blue. Tessa's dress dragged in the dust, veil still trailing behind her like a ghost from a life she no longer wanted. "I did not mean to cause a scene," Isaiah said. "You did not." Her voice was steady now. "He did." They stopped near the watering trough outside the old livery stable. He leaned against the fence rail, arms crossed. His shirt was sun-faded, buttons one short at the top, and his jaw rough with stubble, but his eyes, they were steady. Honest. Tessa sat beside him. "Why did you come?" Isaiah rubbed his thumb across the rim of his hat. "Heard you were marrying a man who liked the sound of his own voice more than yours. Thought it might not sit right with you." It did not. They both looked out at the open land that stretched behind the stable, silent for a while. Somewhere in the distance, a horse huffed and stamped. "I should not have let it get that far," she said. "You walked away. That is more than most would do." She looked down at her hands. "You always say the right things. I just do not like seeing good people pushed into something they cannot feel." He said it like he knew. Maybe he did. That night she stayed at the boarding house. Isaiah saw her to the door, tipped his hat, and said, "If you need help packing or leaving town, I will be here." "I do not know what I need yet," she said. He nodded. "Then I will still be here." 2 days passed. People whispered when she passed by, some with sympathy, some with judgment. Tessa kept her chin up and ignored them. On the third afternoon, a knock came at the boarding house door. She opened it to find Isaiah holding a small basket and a boy of about 5 clinging to his leg. "This here is Victor," Isaiah said. "He is not mine, I mean, not by blood. His mother passed in the spring. She was a friend. I promised I would look after him." Victor looked up at her with wide green eyes, thumb in his mouth. He held a wooden horse in his other hand. "Hi there," Tessa said, crouching to his level. Victor stepped forward and held out the toy. "You can borrow him." Her throat tightened. "Thank you." Isaiah shifted, looking a little uneasy. "I know this is unexpected, but he has been asking for company, and I thought." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Maybe it would be good for both of you." She felt something soft unfurling in her chest. "You want to come in?" He nodded. "I would like that." They sat by the fireplace, Victor curled up with a blanket and the toy horse fast asleep. "I do not know what I am doing," Tessa said, voice low. Isaiah leaned back in the old armchair. "Neither do I." "But you seem like you do." He chuckled, a quiet sound. That is just because I do not talk as much. Tessa smiled, really smiled for the first time in days. Why did you really come to the church, Isaiah? He met her eyes. I could not stand watching you marry someone who would not care for your tears. Her breath caught again. You barely know me. I know enough, he said. I know you helped me when no one else did. I know you listen more than you speak. I know you deserve someone who never laughs when you cry. The room fell quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt full, not empty. Tessa looked at him, really looked. Do you think we could ever start something real? He nodded once, slow and sure. If we do, it will be honest, and it will be ours. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. Isaiah laced his fingers with hers. Neither of them let go. Isaiah rose early, as he always did, and stepped out onto the boarding house porch with Victor balanced on his hip. The boy was still half asleep, cheek resting against Isaiah's collarbone, one hand clutching the hem of his shirt. The morning light stretched long across the main street, catching on the dust that lifted with each breeze. The bakery 2 doors down had just lit its stove, and the scent of ashwood and rising dough curled through the air. Inside, Tessa moved quietly through the kitchen, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hair pulled back with a faded blue ribbon. She didn't glance up when he stepped in, just said, "There's bread warming by the stove and I've boiled coffee." Victor stirred and lifted his head. "Miss Tessa," he mumbled, voice thick with sleep. She turned then, her face softening. "Morning, Victor." "You hungry?" He nodded against Isaiah's shoulder. Isaiah settled the boy at the table, poured black coffee into a tin cup and sat across from her. "He's been asking about you since he opened his eyes." Tessa passed Victor a piece of bread and turned to Isaiah. "He wets the bed sometimes. I know. I left a dry pair of trousers folded in the wash basin. If you want, I can show him how to rinse the others so he learns to do it himself." Isaiah nodded slowly. "He respects you." "That'd help." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that built itself on comfort rather than absence. The floor creaked overhead, another boarder rising late, and the sound of a horse clopping by outside gave rhythm to the quiet. Tessa stirred her coffee once, twice, then looked up. "I've taken a position at the schoolhouse." Isaiah blinked. "I didn't know they were hiring." They weren't, but the teacher's gone east for her father's illness and asked if I'd take over until spring. He studied her a moment before nodding. "You'll do right by the children." "I hope so." Victor dropped a crumb, then reached to press it into the table's crack. Tessa distracted him with a spoon, showing him how to drum it gently on the tin plate. His eyes lit up. Isaiah leaned back in his chair. "I've been offered grazing land north of the Rattlesnake Hills. 30 head if I can fence it by frost." Her brows lifted. "That's a rough stretch. I'm used to quiet country. You going to take it?" "I'm thinking on it." He watched her carefully. She didn't ask what he was waiting on. She already knew. Later that day, she walked him and Victor to the stable. Victor insisted on holding her hand the whole way, swinging their arms as they went. When they reached the corral, Isaiah lifted the boy onto the fence rail. "I'll come by tomorrow," she said, brushing hay from her skirt. "Victor can sit in on lessons if he likes." Isaiah adjusted his hat, eyes on the horizon. "He'll like that." She hesitated, then added, "If you're still in town." His gaze dropped to hers. "I will be." That evening, after the schoolhouse emptied of dust and laughter, Tessa stayed behind to sweep. The chalkboard still held a crooked alphabet, and a single daisy sat in a chipped jar by the window. She watched the light dim, golden and slow. Isaiah arrived just before sundown, Victor riding on his shoulders. He didn't knock, just stood in the doorway until she looked up. "You left your shawl on the fence rail." She crossed the room and took it from him. "Thank you." He didn't move to leave. She asked, "How long have you been alone, really?" He looked down at his boots. "Since my mother passed, I was 17. And since then," he lifted his chin. "There's been no one that stayed." She stepped closer. "Do you want someone to?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I want something that holds." She reached up and pressed her palm to his chest, just over the worn buttons of his shirt. "Then stay. We'll build slow." "But we'll build it." Victor tugged at her skirt. "Can I sleep by the fire again?" She crouched beside him. "If you help me carry the kindling in." Isaiah knelt beside them. "We'll both help." That night the fire crackled low in the hearth. Victor lay curled beneath a quilt, breathing even and deep. Tessa sat beside Isaiah on the floor, knees touching, her hand resting over his. Neither of them spoke. The quiet was full again of choice, of promise. Isaiah turned his hand, threading their fingers together. Tessa didn't let go. The first frost came early. It crept in overnight, quiet as breath, and left a skin of white across the porch rail and the pump handle. Tessa rubbed her hands together and watched her breath rise in the dim morning hush. Victor, bundled in Isaiah's coat, blinked sleepily from where he sat on the steps, boots too big for his feet resting on the cold wood. Isaiah arrived with 2 sacks of oats slung over his shoulder and a fresh nick on his thumb, wrapped in a strip of muslin. He set the feed down by the door and nodded toward the sky. "We'll need to cover the schoolhouse windows before the glass starts cracking." "I've sewn up old quilts for that," Tessa said, brushing her palms against her skirt. "They're thin, but they'll hold." He shifted the weight of the sacks. "I can cut boards to brace them underneath. Might keep more heat in." She looked at the bandage. "You'll be needing a sharper knife." He gave a quiet chuckle. "Or steadier hands, I'll take either." Victor leaned against Tessa's side, tugging at her sleeve. "Can I see the school chickens again?" "They're not going anywhere," she said, brushing his hair gently. "But if you bring them feed without scaring them, they'll come close." Isaiah crouched beside the boy. "You remember how to hold your hand flat," Victor nodded solemnly. "Then you'll do fine." Later that afternoon, Tessa found Isaiah behind the livery, splitting firewood with the wedge and maul. Each strike was clean, deliberate. The pile beside him had grown tall, and he paused only to wipe his brow with a frayed kerchief. She stepped into the shadow of the shed, arms folded against the chill. "You always work until your hands go numb," he glanced over, breath rising in short clouds. "It's the kind of tired that's worth something." She picked up a split log and set it on the stack. "You don't have to do all this, I know." He adjusted his stance for another swing. "But I want to." The log cracked clean through. Tessa reached for another. "When's the last time someone did for you?" He studied her a moment. "I'm not sure I ever counted." She didn't press. Some silences held more than words could carry. As evening settled, Tessa invited him and Victor to stay for supper. The boarding house was near empty now, most boarders gone south for winter or headed to Helena for work. The kitchen smelled of root vegetable stew and cornmeal biscuits, and the table was set with mismatched plates that had belonged to the owner's grandmother. Victor sat between them, humming under his breath as he spooned stew into his mouth. Tessa poured coffee for Isaiah and sat across from him, elbows resting lightly on the table's edge. "My sister wrote from Independence," she said, unfolding the letter from her apron pocket. "Says they've opened a small mercantile. She wants me to visit come spring." Isaiah sipped his drink, listening. "She was always the one who looked ahead. I stayed back, kept to what I knew. You don't strike me as someone who stays put unless she wants to." She looked at him then, steady and long. "I'm not sure I knew what I wanted until now." Victor dropped his spoon and they both reached for it, hands brushing where it landed. Neither pulled away. After supper, they sat near the fire again, Victor asleep against a pillow stuffed with wool and old cotton. Isaiah rested on the floor, legs stretched out, thumb brushing a groove in the wood where feet had worn it smooth. Tessa leaned back in the rocker, shawl draped over her lap, watching the flames curl upward. "I had a hope once," she said, voice low. "Thought maybe I'd marry someone who'd make the world quieter, not louder." Isaiah didn't move, but his eyes held hers. "You don't need quieting, you need seeing." She felt the words settle into the hollows of her ribs, deep as marrow. "You see me," he nodded once. "From the first time you stitched me up, I saw more than you wanted me to. Maybe I was hoping someone would." He rose then, slow and sure, and stepped close. His hand brushed her cheek, calloused thumb tracing just below her temple. "I would never laugh when you cry," he said. "I'd carry it with you if you let me." She stood, hand finding his. Then stay, not just for the night, for good. Victor stirred, murmuring something soft in his sleep, and Isaiah looked down at the boy, then back at her. I've had land. I've had silence. But I never had a home. You do now. She reached up, kissed him slow and certain like the final word of a prayer. Outside, snow began to fall, soft as ash, and in that quiet room lit by firelight, nothing was missing. Not anymore. The snow stayed late into March that year, crusting the schoolhouse eaves and keeping the creeks stiff with ice. Tessa's hands were red from stoking the stove each morning before the children arrived, the iron slow to warm, the drafty floorboards reluctant to hold heat. Still, she came each day before sunrise, Victor walking beside her with a satchel packed with a slate and a half-whittled stick he refused to part with. Isaiah came in the afternoons, once the cattle were fed and the troughs broken open. He'd bring kindling or a bundle of juniper branches for the stove, and wait until the final bell rang before stepping through the door. The children had grown used to his quiet presence, the way he'd nod a greeting and sit near the back, mending a harness or sharpening a draw-knife on a whetstone while Tessa taught. One evening, after the last child had gone, Isaiah stayed behind while Tessa swept the grit from the plank floor. She paused, leaning on the broom handle, and watched him lift a small, battered book from the shelf. "You read?" she asked. He turned the pages slow, careful not to tear the brittle paper. "Enough to follow instructions." "Not enough to enjoy it. I could teach you." He looked up, the firelight catching in his eyes. "You think I'm worth teaching?" "I think you already know more than most men with a library." He set the book down, not looking away. "What would you start with?" She walked over, pulled a stool close to his, and sat. "Something honest, something that doesn't lie about how hard things can be." He tapped the cover of the book he'd opened. "This one's called The Prairie Traveler. Seems like it'd tell the truth." It does. "It's full of instructions for men who don't expect comfort." He met her gaze, something steady building behind his stillness. "That sounds familiar." Tessa reached for his hand, not tentative this time. "Learning's easier when someone's beside you." His fingers curled around hers. "Then I'll stay beside you." Later, as they walked through the snow toward the boarding house, Victor trailing behind and dragging a stick through the drifts, Isaiah glanced up at the sky. "My father couldn't read," he said. "Said words were for preachers and politicians." She looked sideways at him. "What do you say?" "I say words aren't much use unless they mean something." She stopped walking, boots crunching into the frozen crust. "Do mine mean something to you?" He lowered his voice. "They always have." The next morning, as the sun broke through thin cloud and lit the frost in gold, Tessa opened the boarding house door to find a wrapped parcel on the stoop. Inside was a hand-carved wooden box lined with soft wool. Resting inside, a folded letter. The script was uneven, careful, the letters blocky but legible. "For the woman who taught me to listen before I ever learned to read." Tessa pressed the letter to her chest and closed her eyes. That evening, Isaiah didn't knock. He stepped through the door with his usual quiet, stamped the snow from his boots, and removed his hat. "I reckon I'll need a better pencil if we're going to keep this up," he said. Tessa held up the letter. "You already have the most important part of it." Isaiah crossed to her, took her face in both hands, and kissed her slow. No urgency, no doubt. Just a promise, sealed soft and warm against the cold pressing in all around them. Victor, curled near the fire with a blanket and a scrap of bread, didn't stir. The house was quiet and the night outside settled deep. Isaiah rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not going anywhere," she smiled, breath steady. "Neither am I." And for the first time in years for both of them, there was nowhere else they'd rather be. By late April, the thaw had settled in earnest. The branches along the cottonwoods darkened with sap, and the river behind the schoolhouse cracked open and ran fast with meltwater. Mud clung to wagon wheels and boots alike, and the scents of wet earth and pine filled the air so thick it felt like a breath you could taste. Tessa stood at the edge of the pasture behind the boarding house, her skirts mudded at the hem. watching as Victor crouched to examine a cluster of crocuses pushing through the soft ground. Isaiah was a short ways off, mending a split in the fence rail with a hammer and rawhide lacing. The sound of it struck steady like a heart at rest. She turned toward him. "How long do you figure we've got before the cattle start wandering?" Isaiah didn't pause in his work. 2 weeks, maybe less. "If I can finish this stretch by Sunday, I'll bring the rest down from the north slope." "You're not planning to ride out alone again, are you?" He looked up then, eyes sun-lined and sure. "No, I was hoping you and Victor might come with me." She stepped nearer, brushing her hands free of soil. "It's rough up there, no stove, no shelter but canvas and sky. I know, but there's space to breathe, and I want you to see what I've been building." Victor called from the fence line, cupping something small in his hands. Tessa knelt beside him, inspecting the curled green shoot he held out. She smiled, then looked back at Isaiah. "We'll come." 3 days later, they loaded the wagon with cured meat, flour sacks, and the quilted rolls Tessa had sewn through the winter. Victor rode up front between them, his boots tucked beneath a blanket and his eyes wide with expectation. The road north wound slow along the riverbank, past stands of lodgepole pine and birch just beginning to bud. They camped 2 nights, cooking over open flame while the stars hung low and bright above them. On the 3rd morning, they crested the final ridge and looked down on a shallow valley where the grass grew in thick, pale clumps, and the creek ran clear between granite outcrops. Isaiah pulled the team to a stop and let the reins rest slack in his hands. "It isn't much yet," he said. "But it's mine." Tessa stepped down from the wagon. Her boots sank into the soft ground and she turned a slow circle, taking in the open sky, the hush of wind through the tall grass, and the scattered fence posts marking the boundary of what he'd claimed. Victor ran ahead, chasing a crow that lifted into the air with a sharp cry. Tessa crossed the space between her and Isaiah, fingers catching in his coat sleeve. "It's beautiful." He looked at her, not the land. "It could be home if you wanted it." She nodded once. "I do." Over the weeks that followed, they made the land theirs. Tessa cleared brush near the creek and planted early beans and onions in a patch of soft soil. Isaiah built a lean-to from pine planks and canvas, then added a stone hearth from the rocks that bordered the creek. Victor gathered kindling each morning and learned to whistle through a reed, a sound that carried across the valley like birdsong. One evening, as the sun slipped low and cast the hills in amber, Tessa sat beside Isaiah on a fallen log near the fire. Her hands were stained with dirt and wild onion, and her dress smelled of smoke and soaproot. A pot of stew simmered low beside them, and Victor lay curled in the grass with a dog-eared book in his lap. Isaiah broke the silence. "I've been thinking of building a proper house. Wood frame, shingled roof, maybe with a loft." She tilted her head. "What would you need a loft for? Victor's going to need room of his own before long." She rested her head against his shoulder, the fabric of his shirt warm from the sun. "I'd like a window over the sink. We'll put it facing east." They sat like that until the fire cracked low and the stars began to show. Then Isaiah turned to her, one hand gentle at her jaw. "I didn't know how to ask," he said, "but I want to marry you, not just live with you. Not just share the work." She looked into his eyes, the steadiness of them, the quiet promise that had never faltered once since the day he walked into that church. "Yes," she said simply. "Let's do it right." They were married at the creek's edge the following Sunday. Tessa wore a dress she'd sewn from unbleached muslin, and Isaiah had trimmed his beard down with a straight razor until it lay neat against his jaw. The preacher came up from town by wagon, and a few neighbors from a day's ride away stood witness. Victor carried a small bundle of wildflowers and handed them to Tessa just before she took Isaiah's hands. When the vows were said, and the rings exchanged thin bands of hammered brass made by a blacksmith friend, Isaiah leaned forward and kissed her with a patience that held the weight of all the years behind them, and the quiet joy of all the ones ahead. That night, they lay beneath the quilt she had stitched beside the fire back in town, now spread across the plank bed Isaiah had built. The wind brushed soft against the canvas walls, and the scent of pine seeped in through the seams. He traced the line of her arm with his fingertips. "You still glad you walked out of that church?" She turned to him, eyes warm in the dark. "I'm glad you gave me somewhere worth walking to." Outside, the creek ran steady and the stars wheeled slow above the hills. Years passed. The beans took root and the house rose one board at a time. Victor grew tall and strong, learned to shoe horses and recite poetry in the same breath. He carved a nameplate for the house that reads Stillwater and nailed it to the porch beam himself. Tessa and Isaiah never left the valley. They grew old in the rhythm of the land, planting, mending, teaching, tending. Their hands remained calloused, their backs strong, their love quiet but unyielding. And when they looked at each other across a crowded table or a field of waving grass, the knowing in their eyes never faded. They had built something that held, something true, together, forever.